Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington, where we have breaking news about the Americans caught in this escalating war between Israel and Hamas. Speaking from the White House this afternoon, President Biden confirmed that Americans are among those currently being held hostage by Hamas terrorists following this weekend's brutal attack inside Israel. Moments later, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters that the administration believes at least 20 or so Americans are missing. Sullivan cautioned that does not mean everyone missing has been taken hostage. And the State Department just announced that Secretary of State Antony Blinken will be traveling to Israel, leaving tomorrow, to assess the situation. President Biden also said today that the number of Americans killed has risen to 14, and he reaffirmed America's support for Israel while decrying the brutality of Hamas's actions.
The brutality of Hamas, these bloodthirstiness brings to mind the worst rampages of ISIS. This is terrorism. But sadly, for the Jewish people, it's not new. This attack has brought to the surface painful memories and the scars left by a millennia of anti-Semitism and genocide of the Jewish people. So in this moment, we must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. I've directed my team to share intelligence and deploy additional experts from across the United States government to consult with and advise Israeli counterparts on hostage recovery efforts. Because as president, I have no higher priority than the safety of Americans being held hostage around the world.
Today's remarks came after President Biden and Vice President Harris spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as the attacks from Hamas continued today from the air, with dozens more rockets targeting Israeli cities and neighborhoods. This is footage from Richard Engel's crew as he was live on the air earlier today, showing rockets being intercepted in southern Israel. Israel, meanwhile, continued its attack from the air today on Gaza and is preparing for a potential ground invasion there, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of Israeli reservists. The situation on the ground remains highly volatile. Our correspondent Ellison Barber and her crew fled sounds of gunfire just a few miles from the Gaza border.
Carol. You see? Get down, go.
Also today, Israel released body camera video showing officers carrying out what it says was a hostage rescue mission in southern Israel. NBC News cannot independently confirm the events shown, and we should note that blurring on the video was done by Israeli officials. Israel says it has secured its border with Gaza, but in many ways the war is just beginning. And already the fighting has left more than 1,800 people dead, at least 1,000 in Israel, and more than 800 in Gaza. Joining me now is our NBC News team, Ellison Barber on the ground in Israel. Monica Alba is at the White House. Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell joins me here on set, and Tehran Bureau Chief Ali Arouzi is in Iran. Ellison, I want to begin with you. What is the latest on the ground at this hour? We saw increased rocket fire where Hamas had given residents an ultimatum to leave earlier today. What has been the aftermath of those attacks, and is your crew safe?
Yeah, I mean, where we were earlier today, we saw just how quick this happens, right? Gabe, you spent time reporting in Ukraine, and you know in some situations in war when there will be an air raid siren, an alarm alerting people that there is something in the air possibly headed in their direction. Sometimes there's a buffer zone. You have time to get to a shelter to seek safety. In Ukraine and Kyiv, you often have at least 40 minutes because things are being fired from afar. That's not the case here. Where we were today, we were about 2.5 miles from the border with Gaza, and it is not minutes, it is not hours, it is seconds from when you hear an alert saying that there is a warning to when you hear explosions or see something in the air. You really have less than 10 seconds to try and get to a safe place. Where we were, this is a community where there were civilians. Most of them are gone at this point. We initially went there because we'd heard that Israeli forces were trying to evacuate that city. There were there was one man who we spoke to who had still stayed there, and he talked about being there over the weekend and seeing Hamas militants come in, hearing artillery on the street outside of his house and ducking down behind his window because he was afraid if they saw him, they might shoot. We have seen this sort of back and forth as things have escalated, where there are attacks coming by air in waves. Israel says that they have shifted to doing airstrikes in waves right now, while they are also building up infrastructure and adding troops and brigades around the border with Gaza. Hamas has fired a number of rockets throughout the day. You saw that very vividly where Richard Engel was, saw it a little bit where we were. And it's just this constant back and forth right now. And when you speak to Israelis, particularly those like we talked to today who live so close to Gaza, they say you just don't know what is about to happen. One medic we were talking to, he said he'd never experienced anything like this in his life, and he'd never seen anything like this in his life. There's been tension, there's been back and forth in recent years, but this scale of an attack on civilians, in his memory of the last 20, 30 years here, didn't remember it. He talked about feeling like it is the wild, wild west right now, and saying that you don't know what is going to happen in the coming hours, the coming days, and certainly not in the coming weeks. But in Tel Aviv and other cities, Israelis at least are very supportive of the idea of a full ground assault, or the ones we have spoken to at least in Gaza. And it primarily for them is because of the attacks on civilians that in their mind were very unwarranted, unprovoked. They describe it as a terror attack, and the fact that so many civilians are being held hostage right now.
And picking up at that point, Allison, talking about potential ground offensive, yesterday we saw that video of those military assets heading towards southern Israel. What is the latest on that potential ground offensive? Is there any indication how imminent it may be?
Yeah, so Israeli military, they started saying yesterday that there was a full blockade of Gaza. Overnight, they talked about firing over 200 plus missiles into Gaza, saying that they were targeting a Hamas command center as well as a weapons storage unit for Hamas because of the density and things in that area. The spaces they say that they hit were what most of us would consider civilian areas. They hit a mosque. They also acknowledged hitting homes. But again, they say that's because that's where Hamas was operating out of. What they'd also said they'd started to do overnight and into the morning and throughout the day is to move brigades all around the border there with Gaza. They say it's fully secured. As of this morning, they said they'd put about 35 battalions along that border and that they were building up infrastructure around the border with Israel and Gaza. Again, all of that suggesting that some sort of ground assault could happen any minute. Gabe.
Allison, thank you. I want to move now to Monica Alba, who's over at the White House. Monica, the president making a lot of news this afternoon, also his national security advisor. The president confirming American hostages are being held by Hamas. 20 or more Americans are missing, according to the national security advisor. What do we know? What more information do we know? How closely is the U.S. coordinating any rescue efforts there?
Very closely, Gabe. Of course, they are monitoring this. It is really an hour-by-hour situation, according to the White House, and they are coordinating with different law enforcement, like the FBI. They are working with different third-party countries, of course, with Israeli counterparts there on the ground. And the fact that we now know that confirmation that Americans are among those being held hostage by Hamas, that's significant because we know that the U.S. is deploying this team of technical experts who have worked in hostage situations. We're going to go there and essentially work with Israelis to advise them on how to potentially free some of these hostages. And we're not just talking about Americans, though, of course, that will be a high priority, but anyone who is being held. And we know that sometimes these situations can take a very long time. So the U.S. is pledging support in that way, but they're making clear, according to a U.S. official that I spoke with, that that doesn't mean that there are any current plans to send in special forces or U.S. troops with the intent of extracting Americans. So that's not the conversation that they're having, at least right now. Instead, it's all about surging resources there to try to help those that are already trying to free hostages. But given the fluidity and how uncertain some of these numbers are, the fact that it's 20 who are unaccounted for, but we just just don't know how many might be held or how many may be still injured or elsewhere or sadly may have lost their lives. And we know that up till now, it's been confirmed 14 Americans have died in these attacks. But many officials that I've been in touch with say they do anticipate that number could go up. Gabe.
Yeah, so no American boots on the ground, at least not yet, according to the administration. Monica, I want to ask you about the call earlier today between President Biden, the Vice President, and Prime Minister Netanyahu. What more do we know about that call?
Well, this was really a call to continue to pledge this support, this solidarity, to be clear that the U.S. is standing with Israel. But now there's also a little bit more nuance to how the U.S. feels about what could happen next in terms of a potential ground offensive. And the president said clearly that after speaking with Prime Minister Netanyahu, that he does understand that Israel is going to respond in a way that is decisive, that is swift and overwhelming. Those were the words President Biden used, but that also would follow the rule of law. So a hint there, perhaps signaling to a bit of their conversation about trying to take into account a potential civilian toll with that possible action and ground invasion, if that is what happens, into Gaza. So we know that the two spoke about that. This was their third phone call in the last couple of days, and we expect them to stay in very close touch. The U.S. has already sent ammunition, interceptors, essentially whatever Israel is asking for from a military assistance perspective. That will arrive shortly, and then we expect more could be on the way soon. Gabe.
Monica, very briefly, notably, the president did not mention Iran in his remarks. Is the White House still pushing back on those reports that Iran may have been behind the Hamas attack, or what's the latest on what the White House is saying?
Well, they're pointing to the complexity of this and that both Israel and other countries, including the U.S., are obviously analyzing intelligence to try to see if they could identify a, quote, smoking gun that would link Iran directly to this specific attack that we saw, this terrorism from Hamas on Saturday. But because that hasn't been evident, that is just simply something they're saying they can't point to. However, they add the important context in all of these moments that in the past, Iran has supported, financed, and helped Hamas in terms of becoming the terrorist organization that they are today. So there's clearly that historical linkage, but there's nothing in this moment that is a direct tie, even though they are continuing to evaluate that. Gabe.
Monica, how about the White House? Monica, thank you. I want to bring in our Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, thanks so much for joining us here on set. Within the last hour, we just heard that Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading to Israel just tomorrow. What is the significance of this?
To show the close coordination between the U.S., President Biden, of course, and Prime Minister Netanyahu. They've not always had the closest of relationships on the political, the domestic political strife, the Palestinian relationship, frankly. But on this, on Israel's security, Joe Biden is absolutely in lockstep. There's an ironclad understanding there. And this attack was so horrific, it exceeds anything that has ever happened to Israel, since the Six-Day War. So that's basically the mission, is to completely put his arms around it and to coordinate in a way that you can only do face-to-face. They can talk, they can strategize, but with him there, him working with the foreign minister, with his counterparts, and probably with the prime minister himself, who they know each other very well. Tony Blinken was in the White House before, in the State Department before, during previous Netanyahu prime ministers.
Now, the president referenced, and he has been talking a lot about deterrence. That's why the carrier strike group, heading to the Eastern Mediterranean. What is that aimed more towards? Is that aimed at Hamas, Hezbollah, or other countries in the region? Is that Iran? What is the main message, that message of deterrence that the U.S. is trying to take to the Middle East?
3 words: Iran, Iran, and Iran. Iran uses proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas, of course, in Gaza. But it is Iran that arms and trains and resupplies these proxy groups. And Hezbollah would not do anything like open a northern front against Israel from Lebanon without the approval, a green light from Iran.
Andrea, you've covered this region for so long. What do you think that the announcement that there are, in fact, American hostages on the ground, how does that change the state of play?
Well, it changes everything. You can't imagine that the Biden administration was happy about unfreezing $6 billion. It was politically very damaging to them, already has been erroneously. Donald Trump and all the Republican candidates trying to link that to any money that's been spent by Hamas or even Iran on arming Hamas, which is not true. None of it has been spent yet. It's frozen, it's in Qatar, but already they were agreeing to $6 billion unfrozen in a very complicated and politically toxic agreement just to get 5 Americans back, not just, but to get 5 Americans back. Just as Israel, sent back 1,000, more than 1,000 Palestinians just to get 1 Israeli soldier back. So getting hostages back, saving their lives is absolutely critical. But interestingly today, importantly, both as Israeli officials whom I interviewed and what we heard from the White House today is that they're not restraining Netanyahu, at least not publicly, from a ground invasion or anything else he feels he needs to do. That right now that is job 1 for them, not getting their hostages back.
Andrea Mitchell, I want you to stick with me here on set, but I want to get to Tehran right now, and Ali Arouzi, who's been reporting from there. What have we heard today, Ali, from Iranian leadership as questions are still circling about Iran's involvement?
Hey, Gabe. So Iran's top authority, Ayatollah Khamenei, gave his first televised speech today since the attacks happened, and he denied Tehran was involved. But he did hail the attacks. He glorified the attacks, saying, Israel was imperably military and intelligently defeated. He was wearing a Palestinian-style scarf to show solidarity with Hamas, and he went on to say that he kisses the hands of those who planned the attack on the Zionist regime. Iranian officials don't refer to Israel as Israel. They call it the Zionist regime. He called the attack a destructive earthquake that has destroyed critical infrastructure in Israel, which can't be repaired easily. And then he went on to warn the Israelis that any attack on Gaza, as he put it, would unleash a much heavier torrent of anger. Now, Gabe, even though officials here have denied any involvement, Tehran has openly and enthusiastically supported these attacks by Hamas. Leading up to these attacks, there was a flurry of senior Hamas leaders visiting Tehran, holding meetings with top officials, including Khamenei. If you look at the IRGC channels, there was a lot of cheer and a lot of pride in these attacks. And even though ideologically Hamas and Iran are not on the same page, they do share one common goal, and that's the destruction of Israel. And that's why Iran has thrown all of its weight behind Hamas, because it supports it financially. It's given it vast quantities of weapons. You look at Khamenei's website, they keep boasting about, Soleimani helping the Palestinians fight Israel with rockets and not rocks anymore, talking about the Iranians helping them circumvent blockades to get weapons into there. So even though the Iranians are denying that they were involved in any of the planning of this attack, they certainly support Hamas up into a huge degree financially and militarily, and that's not something they're hiding. They're very open about that. And the U.S. says that there was no smoking gun, but they say Iran was complicit, and you can see why.
Right, and Ali, Iran walking that fine line, not taking responsibility, but still glorifying the attack, as you reported. I want to ask you about reports of Hezbollah firing rockets into Israel from Lebanon. What does Hezbollah's involvement mean, potentially, for a larger conflict across the region?
Well, I mean, that could be a huge conflict, because firstly, if Hezbollah get involved, you're not talking about Palestine anymore. You're talking about another country getting involved, and that's Lebanon, where Hezbollah is based. But unlike Hamas, I mean, Hamas wouldn't take direct orders from Iran. They will do what they need to do. Hezbollah will take direct orders from Iran. Hezbollah's spiritual leader, Hassan Nasrallah, says that they take direction and they take orders from Iran. Hezbollah is an Iranian creation. So they're very much in Iran's pocket. Whatever they do is by direction of Iran. And if we're going to take Khamenei's warning seriously, he's saying that if Israel goes into Gaza, then this will unleash much greater anger and terror. That could be an indication that Hezbollah will get much more heavily involved than they are right now. But, then all bets are off. That would unleash a massive conflict that could engulf several countries in this region, and then that could really be a very long, very bloody, and very undetermined fight.
Ali Arouzi in Tehran and Andrea Mitchell here with me on set. Thank you to you both. And still ahead, after the worst terrorist attacks in 50 years, Israel's challenge now is how to respond, what an all-out invasion of Gaza could mean for the region and the world. That's next. Plus, the stories of agony from the families with loved ones missing amid what a senior defense official called ISIS-level savagery. And later, as President Biden responds to this international crisis, back at home, he sat down for an interview with a special counsel investigating his handling of classified documents. We'll dive into what that means for where that investigation could be going next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. More than 1,000 people are confirmed dead in Israel after those brutal attacks by Hamas on Israeli villages, homes, and the music festival. And more than 100 people are believed to be held hostage in Gaza, including American citizens. Families are in agony, waiting for news on their missing loved ones.
She was saying, "Mommy, we are trying to get out of here, but I'm bleeding. We were shot. Everybody here was shot." And she said, "Mommy, I'm afraid I will die." And I said, "No, you're not going to die."
I'm trying to be strong, but it's so hard. I'm just hoping they are alive because I can't deal with something like this.
I could hear people speaking in Arabic outside their door. And they broke in, and the last thing I heard was the youngest, who's 12, saying to them, "I'm too young, don't take me."
It is our hope, which is a little bit ridiculous at this stage to say that the optimistic scenario here is that she's held hostage in Gaza and not dead on the street of the kibbutz where we grew up.
We don't know if she's in Israel, if she's in Gaza. Even if I know that she's in Israel, she's probably dead. And if she's in Gaza, well, I've seen what they can do. I just can't describe in words. I said in previous interview that I'm almost ashamed to be called a human being if other human beings can do such things to their own kind.
When I saw that video, my husband and I burst into tears and started shaking. It's something that no parent, no human can ever imagine, to see a child in the hands of terrorists. It felt like a horror movie. It felt like, there are television shows about this, there's movies about this. This doesn't happen in real life.
I'm willing to get killed right now for their lives.
Anything to bring them home.
They can take me for as long as they want.
Just heartbreaking to hear all those stories. And joining me now is Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the United States. And as an officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, he was also a paratrooper during the 1982 Lebanon War. He was the IDF spokesman during the Second Lebanon War and the Gaza operation in 2009. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. And we just heard those devastating accounts from the families of the missing. Ambassador, I want to talk to you about the effect of this war on Israel's psyche. You wrote in The Atlantic yesterday, quote, "The Yom Kippur War had a profound impact on Israeli society and politics. The current conflict, too, is certain to have a tectonic effect, further shaking Israel's confidence in the government and perhaps even the army, and making them either more opposed to or more desperate for peace." Is that shaken confidence likely to be most profound among younger Israelis who might not remember the previous conflict, Ambassador?
And certainly, and seeing those interviews, and we're living this reality here, Gabe. We all know people who are going through this. We all know families that have been taken out and shot. We all know young people who are present at that rave concert. 260 young people just simply massacred in cold blood, and we're still in deep shock. But the shock does not prevent us from acting. And the Army has now called up 300,000 reservists. The report for duty is more than 100%, if that's possible. And Israel is ready to defend itself, the people of Israel. Today I was at a food collection center for soldiers, and just piles and piles of cakes and cookies for our soldiers as they go off to battle. So this country is far, far from defeated, but yes, shaken. And that could be understood. And it's going to have ramifications socially, politically. After each one of these wars, there's always a committee of investigation, and responsibility is apportioned. Heads do roll, and a future of the peace process as well.
And Ambassador, you mentioned that, so many people are connected to this in Israel. And as you wrote in the piece, and I want to make sure our viewers understand, there have been many comparisons, as you made, to the 1973 Yom Kippur War. But in what key ways does this unfolding war now differ?
It's different because that war, 73, was fought in the distant desert and up on the Golan Heights, fought by regular armies with tanks and planes. This war was fought by terrorists penetrating 22 villages and killing civilians, women, children, old people. And so it's very different. Hostages taken, at least 100 hostages taken. Just tonight, they discovered close to 100 bodies in a kibbutz. Keep 1,000 Israeli dead in American terms would be about 15, 16 times what America lost on 9/11. We're talking about the equivalent of 40,000 Americans killed in an afternoon. So it's quite a shock for this country. It's the largest number of Jews killed in any incident since the Holocaust. And so that is deeply impactful. And for our younger people, it'll make them, even those people who are maybe in favor of a two-state solution with the Palestinians, they look at the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, where there's a Palestinian Authority leader, Mahmoud Abbas, who's serving in the 18th year of his 4-year term. He won't run because Hamas will take over the West Bank as well. They're going to be opposed, these young Israelis, to any type of solution that would put Hamas along our entire border opposite our major cities. I'm talking to you from South Tel Aviv in my bomb shelter, but I have a window. I look out that window and I can see the outskirts of Hebron.
And Ambassador, some Israelis are blaming or laying blame at the government, upset that, it was caught off guard. Yesterday the Prime Minister called for a unity government, but is that too little, too late? Does this risk furthering political divisions within Israel, especially since over the last several months there had been so much controversy and so many protests over the judicial overhaul there?
Indeed. But tonight there was a national unity government formed, and that was very timely, very important. There's going to be a time for investigating this. That time is not now. Right now we have to defend ourselves. Right now we have to rid our border and I think the Gaza Strip of Hamas. And Israelis are uniting and not questioning right now, not apportioning blame. That will come. Certainly, there'll be a reckoning.
Ambassador Michael Oren, I know you got to go. Thank you so much for your time and joining us here on Meet the Press Now. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And up next, with war now raging, House Republicans are about to huddle behind closed doors as Congress remains paralyzed without a House Speaker. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Stay with us. And welcome back. The first major piece of legislation has been introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives tied to the escalating war between Israel and Hamas. It comes in the form of a bipartisan resolution standing with Israel. It's being backed by nearly 400 House members. That's nearly the entire chamber. While it has overwhelming support, it currently has no path to passage, not until there's a new speaker anyway. Remember, without an elected speaker, the House can't pass anything from emergency military aid for Israel to even a simple resolution. But in roughly 30 minutes from now, House Republicans will be gathering behind closed doors to hold a forum for speaker candidates as the conference hopes to begin rallying around someone who can unify the conference, and quick. Joining me now on Capitol Hill is NBC's Saho Kapoor. And Saho, we're just a few minutes away from the Republican conference meeting. Unless something drastically changes, does anyone have a path to getting the necessary support to get to the floor?
Not at the moment, Gabe. We are not expecting white smoke from this House Republican meeting, but they will gather behind closed doors at 5 p.m. Eastern time today, where the major candidates for Speaker will present themselves to the conference and make their case. That is Steve Scalise, the House Majority Leader, currently the second in line to former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. And then there's Jim Jordan, the other major candidate of Ohio, a right-wing firebrand, who is currently the chair of the Judiciary Committee. Currently, none of them has anywhere close to the 217 votes they'll need to become Speaker. And Gabe, it's a tall order because there are 221 Republicans and any candidate is going to need 217 of those members to become Speaker on the floor of the chamber. Remember, there are no Democrats expected to vote for a Republican Speaker, and this is a narrow majority. Today is going to be a forum. They're going to discuss the way forward. There are some who want to make a change to the rules to ensure that no ballots take place on the floor of the House until Republicans have unified behind a Speaker to prevent that embarrassing 15 rounds from happening again. And then tomorrow they're going to vote on a way forward. Highly unclear between today and tomorrow that they'll come to an agreement as to who should be their next Speaker.
So, Saho, would you rather be Steve Scalise or Jim Jordan right now?
It's an excellent question. If you look at the public numbers in terms of who is endorsed who publicly, then you got to say that Jim Jordan has the edge. We can simply count more members on the Republican side who say they will vote for him. But Steve Scalise is the heir apparent, and this will be at least, the vote tomorrow will be a closed ballot, and we are expecting a lot of members who haven't publicly announced to be in favor of Scalise. So behind closed doors, there's a school of thought that Scalise might, be in a better position here. But at the end of the day, going by the public numbers, eventually people are going to have to put their name to their vote. And who's going to wear who down? There are some who think Jordan has the edge. It's very, very difficult to say, Gabe.
And Saho, I'm told that you have some reporting about where Israel funding can go once we have a speaker. What can you tell us about that?
That's right. Well, currently, as you point out, it can't go anywhere. The House of Representatives cannot vote on any legislation, even a symbolic resolution like the one you put forward that has near unanimous support, without electing a speaker. But there is a school of thought, there's a belief in the Biden administration and lawmakers in both parties that there should be an aid package that goes to multiple American allies who are under attack. That includes Israel, that includes Ukraine. There are a lot of skeptical House Republicans, though. I put this idea to many House Republicans last night at their meeting, and they're not in favor of it. There are some who say emphatically they're not going to support aid to Ukraine under any circumstances. That includes lawmakers like Brian Mast of Florida, Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, simply not in favor of it, whether it's whatever the package is. And there are other Republicans who say they do favor aid to Ukraine, but they don't want it tied to Israel. They say Israel should be dealt with first, should be dealt with separately, and they should consider aid to Ukraine. Still, aid to Ukraine on a very perilous path forward. Ultimately, it's going to need the support of the House Republican majority. Gabe.
Saho reporting live for us on Capitol Hill. Saho, thanks so much. And we learned late last night that President Biden sat down for an interview with the special counsel leading the criminal investigation into his handling of classified documents. According to the White House, the president participated in a voluntary interview Sunday and Monday with Special Counsel Robert Hur, signaling that the criminal probe could be coming to an end. NBC's Ryan Riley has the latest on what we know. And Ryan, what does this signify about this interview happening? Does it look like this investigation is wrapping up? The White House, U.S. officials had said that this had been scheduled, though, for weeks.
Yeah, you typically don't get this sort of interview unless you're really getting to the end of things. And I think that the closest analog we can point to is really arguably what brought Donald Trump to power in the first place back in 2016, the interview with Hillary Clinton. And that involved Hillary Clinton going to the FBI and conducting this interview. It was sort of the last step in the investigation into her handling of classified documents before the thing was ultimately closed out, of course. So I think that that's sort of where we would track this. This is a much different situation, I would say, though, versus Trump, because obviously if this had involved Donald Trump doing some sort of interview, you wouldn't have a situation where it kept so secret. That was the big sort of news to me, is that this held on both Sunday and Monday when he conducted these interviews. Of course, he has the advantage of being able to conduct this in the White House, so there wasn't any public spectacle around this. But I think that does indicate that we're coming to a close here.
And speaking of former President Trump, he's brought up this a lot, contrasting it or bringing it up in the context of his own special counsel investigation in regards to classified documents. Lay out for our viewers, what are the key differences between the two cases?
Well, in Biden's case, it involved a garage, and then in Trump's case, it involved documents around a toilet with a chandelier above. So that's one little bit of a difference. But I think overall, a little bit. But I think overall, the broader thing is here the level of cooperation and working with the special counsel here in this case, Special Counsel Hur, because that's not something that we saw on the Trump side. And I think had the Trump situation gone a different way and there weren't these allegations that he was hiding information information and trying to hold back information from the federal government. I think you can conclude that the Justice Department would have been very hesitant to bring forward charges against Trump had there just been more of a level of cooperation. So I think predictably, probably what we're looking at, unless there are any surprises that came out of this interview, is probably some sort of closure to this investigation. I guess the big question is whether or not there's going to be some sort of report, which might be critical at all of Biden, even if there's not criminal charges brought forward.
Yeah, and that was my next question. How long might it take to write up that report? We just don't know.
Yeah, we really don't know, but I would expect that, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, would be expected to make that public. But, obviously Hur has sort of looked at what's happened to other individuals who have investigated, and he knows what he has coming when it comes to the House Republicans in terms of oversight of that investigation. So he knows there's going to be a critical eye on this. But remember, he's a Republican appointee. He was appointed by Donald Trump previously and is well respected and had a history of a career nonpartisan federal investigator.
Critical eye is an understatement. Ryan Riley, thank you so much. And next, mounting questions over Israeli intelligence and the U.S.'s visibility into an escalating wartime situation. We'll talk to the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Mark Warner, next. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
Let me say again, to any country, any organization, anyone thinking of taking advantage of this situation, I have one word: don't. Don't. Our hearts may be broken, but our resolve is clear.
And welcome back. This afternoon, President Biden reiterated that Israel will have unequivocal U.S. backing as it responds to ongoing attacks by Hamas. But the details of what that support looks like are still taking shape. Meanwhile, members of both the House and Senate Intelligence Committees are receiving intelligence briefings on the war today. In just a moment, Senator Mark Warner is going to join us, but we're working out a technical issue with him. But joining me now on set, Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and an NBC News political analyst, Democratic pollster Margie O'Mara, and Brendan Buck, former advisor to House Republican Speakers John Boehner and Paul Ryan, as well as an NBC News analyst. And Peter, I just saw you a short time ago over at the White House. You were there for the president's remarks. Yeah. What did you make of his speech? Did he strike the proper tone here?
Well, I was really struck, actually, because I've heard a lot of presidents denounce terrorism in Israel over the years, going back to the 90s when I started there. And I have to say this is probably one of the sharpest and angriest I've ever heard a president. He used examples that were visceral and outraged. He used words like atrocities and butchered and evil at least 3 times. He left no room for any distinction between his view and Israel's view of the attack on Hamas, even, of course, as he promised more aid and promised to be standing by Israel throughout what happens next.
If there was any tension, and there clearly was any tension between the president and Prime Minister Netanyahu for years, you didn't see it today.
No, you really didn't. And he had just come from a phone call or a video call with Prime Minister Netanyahu, he and the vice president. And the Israelis put out a little bit of what the prime minister told him. And you could see how, therefore, the president would be kind of riled up. The prime minister told him about some of the specific atrocities, including children and old folks and Holocaust survivors who have been targeted by Hamas. And it clearly got to the president because he was conveying that in a very personal way today.
And Brendan, I want to turn to you. We're a long way from politics, stepping into the water's edge here. But with the president, how has he done so far? Has he made the right moves in order to stop Republican criticism that he may have been emboldening Iran here by his previous foreign policy?
Yeah, as Peter said, it was a really strikingly strong statement. And I think part of it you have to assume is to not leave any space for that criticism to come in. And I have to say, I think he did that. He was very strong in what he talked about, and he probably learned the lesson from his predecessor, President Obama. I know Peter remembers well the seemingly silly debate now of whether he called Benghazi terrorism in the aftermath. He made clear in no uncertain terms the moral stakes that are going on here. Of course, we're in the very beginning of this. There's a long way to go. Statements at this junction matter a lot, and the way that he's been able to bring together foreign leaders matter a lot. We got a long way to go. We know that there's going to be an interaction with Congress on this, and so there's still more to come. But I think he's done a lot, the best he can do to prevent some of that political attacks from seeping into what's been going on.
And Margie, excuse me. These were his second on-camera remarks that he did following, when the fighting began. Has the president been out in front of this enough over the last couple of days. The White House making a point to, release this long list about, 30 interactions, meetings, phone calls that he's had.
Joint statement with other leaders.
Right.
I mean, there's been a lot, and I agree. I had the same reaction watching it that Peter did. That he was very crisp and clear and emotional and said exactly, it reinforced the values that he shared, that Americans share. I think I disagree with Brendan that this will stop Republican criticism, not because of something that the president did, just because I've been watching Republicans, and many of them really look for any opportunity to make something political or partisan. And I think it would be a mistake as voters are tuning into this issue, who may not be following this issue closely the rest of the time, now are paying attention to hear from Republican leaders sort of the same old kind of partisan attacks, the way you heard from the head of the Republican Party say this is an opportunity. That's the kind of partisanship that people really have had enough of, and I hope we don't see that. I don't know if I share Brendan's optimism, but I know
he knew what was
he
coming.
did what he had to do.
Yeah.
But I think Republicans have now kind of lost that ability, that muscle to say, like, okay, let's come together for in a bipartisan way.
And it's tough for them to make that argument, considering that they don't have a Speaker of the House. They have their own infighting to worry about. Before I get to the situation on Capitol Hill, though, which is our next topic, I wanted to bring in Peter one more time. The president did not mention Iran at all today in his comments. What'd you make of that?
Yeah, the administration is taking a cautious approach when it comes to Iran in terms of blaming it or assigning responsibility to Iran. Partly, I think, because they obviously want to avoid an escalation if they can. That's one of the reasons why they've sent the carrier group to the eastern Med in order to deter any potential Iranian direct involvement. Also, because what they're telling us is their intel yet has not established any direct connection. Now, of course, Hamas is, to some extent, a creature of Iran. It's obviously been supported by Iran for many, many years. You don't get that many missiles to fire at Israel without Iran's help. But so far, what the American intelligence is saying is they don't have anything to say specifically that Iran knew and was participating in the planning for this operation. So I think they're trying to keep careful until they get that kind of evidence.
But they're also making the point that Iran and Hamas have had a very long relationship here. So, Brendan, I want to turn to the situation on Capitol Hill. I asked our reporter Sahil on the Hill, who would he rather be at this point, Steve Scalise or Jim Jordan? I'll ask you the same question. Who's looking better right now?
Yeah, I honestly have no idea. And I'd like to be able to point you in one direction or the other. I don't know who's going to win. There's a lot of people who are undecided at this point. One thing I probably challenge on what Sahil said earlier, that there's this narrative that no one has 217, 218 votes right now, so that we're going to be in this for a long time. I don't know that I buy that. I think whoever wins in that closed-door meeting, all you have to have is a simple majority. I think whoever wins that simple majority is very likely to be the next Speaker of the House.
Do you think the situation right now in the Middle East is adding a new urgency to the Republican conference to choose that Speaker?
I do, in two ways. One, there's obviously the idea that they need to pass something relatively soon. But I think the bigger issue is that this whole situation, I think, puts in stark contrast how sort of silly what's been going on in the House is. And it makes them seem very small and petty. And I think a lot of them are sitting there thinking, we probably need to get our act together sooner rather than later. We can't allow this to bleed into another few weeks. So whether or not they're able to pull that off, there's been a lot of times where members thought they needed to get their act together and couldn't. But I do think this makes them think long and hard about how much time and space they have to act like this.
And Margie, to that point, how are Democrats looking at this and looking at the chaos in the Republican conference? Are they just kind of sitting back and watching it all happen?
Democrats want to get stuff done. And look, let me tell you how voters react to this. And I did focus groups. Now it feels like eons ago when we thought there might be a shutdown, but we still had a speaker.
That was how long ago?
I think it was 3 weeks or 2 weeks ago.
A couple weeks
ago.
2 weeks.
But it felt like a long time ago. And I do a lot of focus groups. I've done maybe 150 focus groups over the last 2 years. I've had an increasing number of people in tears over all kinds of things, the economy, abortion bans, et cetera. I did not expect people to come to the focus group in tears thinking about a shutdown, because they were thinking about the things that would be cut that would affect them personally. So this is real. And when they see what happens when Republicans can't get their act together, they can't decide, they're playing political games, they think they don't really have the same sense of urgency. Because if they had the same sense of urgency, they would not act this way. If they felt what I felt about the importance of having the government function, having a speaker, having a Washington, D.C. that works and functions, they would not act this way.
And do you think that, that was part of the reason, at least, why Kevin McCarthy decided, look, we're going to have to go for this stopgap measure because I don't want to get blamed for the shutdown?
I couldn't decide how he, I would like to think he was influenced by our focus group showing that people would find that want to see people.
Maybe not the focus groups, but that idea that voters are paying attention to this.
I would hope that all members of Congress think about what is the legacy of my service that I'm doing here, as opposed to, having sort of a zinger or a fun day on Twitter. What is my purpose in public service? And is it to make the American country and the people more united and have our government function? I don't know if Kevin McCarthy was thinking that or if other members were thinking that, but that's what they should be thinking about.
And Peter, I want to turn to you, and I want to play a little bit of sound from former Speaker Kevin McCarthy on this program yesterday with Ryan Nobles. Let's take a listen.
Are you a candidate in that conversation?
No, I'm not a candidate. Whoever the conference picks, I'm going to support.
But if the conference chooses you, if there's been a number of moderate Republicans who have come out and said that they think that you should attempt to reclaim the speakership, if that were to happen, would you accept the position?
96% of there. Let the conference decide that. The conference has to unify.
I want to definitively make this clear. You are not ruling yourself out as a potential Speaker of the House.
Listen, the conference can do whatever they are. I am not a candidate for it. The conference makes that whoever they think.
And then.
Look, he just spent the day talking about standing with Israel. Does this look like somebody who's fading away from public life and fading away from being Speaker?
No. Am I saying where he was saying, I will take myself out of the run? No, look, I think you're right. He does obviously still harbor some possible hope that maybe a brokered conference leads them to say, let's go back for the grown-up version of this, and McCarthy is the best grown-up we have, and so let's go ahead and put him back. Brendan would know better. I think that's probably not likely at this point. I think the conference is ready to move on, but he's not ready to move on. He's a young guy. He'd like to still do something like that.
Well, Brendan, look, there's some moderates that say that they might still back him. Do you count him out?
Yeah, I do. I don't hate to say that. No, I think Peter's right. He's probably wanted to at least test the idea. Do people have any regrets over what they did? I don't think they do, and I think some of those people have made very clear they're not going to vote for him. Now, some of this may be him trying to influence the outcome of the election. It's been long reported that he has some tension with Steve Scalise. Maybe he's trying to hold off some of his members who like him instead of who might otherwise be siding with Steve Scalise. I don't know if that's actually going to, if that's going to impact the outcome. But it feels like he's trying to at least put his fingers a little bit on what's happening.
And in that interview and in several interviews before and after that, he has still tried to make the case that it was actually Democrats that actually somehow voted him out. And Margie, what do you make of that? What do you make of, Kevin McCarthy still trying to blame Democrats for his ouster, even though it was those hardline Republicans that obviously got him out?
I mean, look, I guess if what else is there to say? He still wants to potentially have those members vote for him, his Republican caucus. So, I don't think it's a credible argument, and I don't think it's going to persuade any swing voters. It's not going to persuade, voters in districts where there's a Republican member, but the district voted for Biden. It's not going to convert any Democrats, to be sure. Does it feel good for Republicans to say that? Maybe it does, but it's clearly not the reality.
All right. Thank you so much for being here, all three of you, Maggie Amaro, Peter Baker, and Brendan Buck. We will be right back.
Thank you.
And welcome back. Back to the breaking news tied to the Israeli-Hamas war and the U.S.'s involvement. We have just learned that the carrier strike group deployed by the U.S. military has now arrived in the eastern Mediterranean Sea as the White House looks to deter a potential escalation in the war. The strike group includes the U.S. aircraft carrier Gerald R. Ford, 8 squadrons of attack and support aircraft, a guided missile cruiser, and other assets. And it comes as thousands of Israelis are lining up to donate blood as hospitals across the country are preparing for further conflict. NBC foreign correspondent Kelly Kobiea is at a hospital in Tel Aviv with more.
Well, we are in a hospital lobby, the largest hospital in all of Israel here in central Tel Aviv, and this has been turned into a blood donation center. They were adding beds as we arrived. That's how large the outpouring is to donate blood. In fact, there's a line all the way down the hospital corridor of people waiting to donate. One man said he planned to come here on his lunch hour and was told to come back in 3.5 hours. That's how long the wait is. Below ground, they are turning a multi-story car garage into a hospital. The parking bays have been marked out to accommodate hospital beds. There are machines and power units on the walls so they can have kidney dialysis machines and life support machines below ground. They're setting up a pediatric unit below ground. They say to move patients who may be a little bit more vulnerable in upper floors down below ground just in case there is a missile strike or several missile strikes here in Tel Aviv. On the ground in Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces say they are amassing troops on the border with Gaza. They are continuing this counteroffensive in the air, some 200 strikes on Islamic Jihad and Hamas positions inside Gaza. They say they hit 2 mosques, one of which they say was a command center, the other a place where weapons were being stored. But for civilians in Gaza, the situation is increasingly dire. The United Nations says 187,000 people are now displaced. The vast majority of them are being cared for in shelters. There are nearly 800 dead now, among them more than 100 children. There are images of children being pulled out of the rubble of buildings by rescue workers and put into ambulances. And the UN also says that the hospitals are just barely functioning now, that they're running very low on medicine and on fuel used to power the generators to keep those hospitals running.
Kelly Kobiea for us in Tel Aviv. Kelly, thank you. And thank you for being with us this hour. I'm Gabe Gutierrez. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.